Hi, good morning. This is the second attempt at doing this live streaming, but I will talk fast because I want to be respectful of time. So it's the 21st of December. We like to do these webinars a couple of times a week these days. And so just as a background, there is free material regarding electrochemical biosensors on the ZP Academy. There are these webinars. We do have collaborations. We do offer up, and collaborations are really things that happen in funded programs with academia. We do have jobs, and we do have the developer zone, and we do have workshops. The workshops are super relevant to anyone who's actually interested in doing wearables, so super relevant to the questioner about, I think it's sodium, potassium, and calcium. The whole philosophy at ZP really is to kind of say there are real world applications out there, and there are people who are trying to provide solutions to those problems. Now, if it involves sensors, we do have these pre-existing technologies. I've kind of grouped it here under the Sense It All platform, but all of our technologies, all is a strong term, but a lot of our technologies are actually cloud enabled. So our business model really is to provide technologies to others so that they can go to market with sensing ideas. Those technologies can include the sensors, the electronics, the cloud part, and we have the kind of whole technology stack, and we use what's relevant at that particular time. The cloud does have an API included in it, or in it. An API is an application programming interface, and this is the kind of part that allows our cloud to talk with other people's cloud. The whole way we've developed this is that sensors are sort of put into the hands of real users. The data goes up to the cloud. You can look at that data then and make sure that it's making sense. If it's not making sense, we can start to iteratively improve the algorithms, and that's really this kind of cycling is a lean startup mentality. I've said it in the first version of this webinar. As I say, I had to cancel it because of the internet, but I was saying there that understanding business strategy is part of potentially becoming like a senior scientist in any kind of role. It's good to understand business strategy. We do have these webinars. There's one on Sense It All in January, and there's also one on food sense in January. If you're interested in, if you're interested in making products, Sense It All is definitely the place for you. And if you want to see a product in action, then come along to the food sense webinar as well. Also, if you're interested in the commercialization of electrochemical assays, or interested in networking with the kind of people who can hire you, then I would actually come to this S Cubed conference in the UK in June 2024. The questions today, one of them is about detecting cadmium in zinc. I'm very interested in the detection of heavy metals. I've always thought about it from an environmental perspective, but the question also made me realize that you can do it from an industrial perspective as well. Just understanding how much cadmium is in zinc is a valid question. The other question then was around a replacement for SPCE 101. This is a screw-fed electrode from Metro, so I've recommended the 501 to them. I'm also going to talk about connectors. It's important to have good connectors. Also sensors for measuring calcium, potassium, and sodium in the skin. I will comment upon that today. It is the hardest thing you can do, is to do sensors in a wearable type application, but I'm sure you know that. And then lastly, it's really a sort of personal reflection on how to get senior positions in electrochemistry, so I will touch upon that as well. We do have these electrochemical biosensors, and we also have screen-printed electrodes. This is the kind of heart of what we do. The biosensors, the screen-printed electrodes, and the Sense It All is really at the heart of what we do, and I do have links to it here. The particular inquirer today, what they really need is the carbon 501, and there's a link to the carbon 501, but they'll also need connectors as well. Again, I'm going quite fast because I've already had a first attempt at this webinar. The internet for some reason was dropping out, so I had to start again. So I want to be quick. The level of cadmium in zinc, in a zinc sample. So first of all, just to say that if you're more interested in just measuring zinc or cadmium in a sample, then we do have the Sense It All platform. And I do have a link to some of the material supporting that application on the website as well. I'll try to remember to put the link underneath this YouTube video. In the question, I think really the question sounds like a sort of almost like a university question to a student. So I've got a suspicion that is the background to this. But in the question, there's some assumption that you do know. They talk about polography. I think polography is a horrible term. It really refers to dropping mercury electrodes, and in this day and age you know, it's almost well, I would say it's illegal to be using mercury in a lab in most parts of the world. It's you know, so the term polography is a kind of hang up from days when people were using what's called dropper mercury electrodes. That said, my answer today is still valid. But then the other assumption that's not really stated by the questioner is that zinc has a kind of peak potential at let's say it's between minus 1500 to 1000 millivolts, whereas the cadmium is approximately 650 millivolts, which I think is what they've put in the question. So the assumption that you make is that most of the electrochemical signal that you see in the question is actually coming from the cadmium, which is fair enough, but you kind of have to know that in order to then answer the question. So not all of the information you would otherwise need is necessarily in the question. So the first part of the question is they sort of describe this system where they have 1 gram of zinc, they dissolve it in 50 mils of 6 molar HCl. So that's really just to dissolve the zinc up and get it into probably like zinc chloride. Then they dilute it up to 250 mils in a volumetric flask. I will comment on that in a minute, because what it really just says is you've got 1 gram of zinc and you've actually dissolved it into 250 mils of, let's say, water. The fact that you went by a two-step process doesn't really make any difference in the maths. Then they took 25 mils of that and they put it into, they say here, a sort of polographic cell. It's not a nice word, polographic, just because it kind of, I think it can confuse people, and it's not an instrument that I come across anymore. I mean, polography, as I say, makes me think of dropping mercury electrodes. It doesn't matter in this point. Just call it a cell. And then they say the oxygen is flushed out, because the reason they say that then is they know that oxygen also has a reduction, electrochemical activity in that region. So I can see why they're kind of making a point of saying that the oxygen is flushed out. And then they say that they probably scanned from 0 to potentially, I don't know if they're saying 0 to minus 1 volts or what there, but actually I think that is what they're saying. And then they say there's a wave which has a half potential of about 650 millivolts, and it gives 32 units of galvanometer deflection. This is all fine. I mean, in the end, so they take 1 gram, they dissolve it into 250 mils, they take 25 mils of that, they then test it on an electrode, and they get a certain amount of, I'm going to call it current, of 32 units. Okay, I can deal with that. And then they add to that 25 mils, 5 mils of 5 times 10 to minus 4 molar of, which is actually 0.5 millimolar, but doesn't matter, of cadmium chloride. And they then, again, there's no oxygen in there, so they're trying to make sure that you understand there's no oxygen interference. And then they do the test again, and they get 77.5 units of current. And then they give you one piece of information. Well, so there's one piece of information, which is the atomic weight of the cadmium, which is, I think, fine. So I'll slightly drag myself out of this. I think I want to drag myself out of this image, which I'm trying to do. All right, well, maybe I can't. Let me go forward. Let me just turn my camera, let me just turn my video off for a second so that actually I can see that. Because what I want to say here is, the first part of this is they take 1 gram of the zinc, they do dissolve it up in 50 mils, and that's just to kind of, because it's strong acid, and then they make that up to 250 mils. So what they're really saying is we've got 1 gram in 250 mils, which means that we've got 0.004 grams per mil. That's really taking care of the first statement that 1 gram goes into 250 mils. I will come back to that in a minute. So 1 gram in 50 mils, that doesn't matter so much, because in the end it's the 1 gram gets made up to 250 mils, which leads to the 0.004 grams per mil of that original metal. That original metal, and they take 25 mils of it and they put it into this cell and they record 32 galvanic deflection, they call it. So 32, I just put there. Now the next thing that happens is they add in this 5 mils of cadmium chloride. Now the first thing that happens is when you add in the 5 mils, you're essentially diluting the original sample. So the 25 mils goes to 30 mils. So what I've done here is I've actually said, take that 32 of activity, divide it by 30 and times it by 25. Because now because essentially you have diluted the signal. It's gone down to 26.67. So what I've done here is first of all, I've only taken account of what's called dilution, because they had 25 mils of the original solution and it gave you 32 signal. Then you added another 5 mils. And in doing so, you've actually ended up diluting the signal. But of course, I know they didn't dilute it because they've actually added cadmium chloride. But this is my kind of, if cadmium chloride wasn't electrochemically active, this would be where that signal actually was. As it was, the signal went to 77.5. Let's say it actually went to 77.5. So that means that if I take 77.5 minus 26.67, I've got additional signal of 50.83 that came from the 5 mils of adding this amount of cadmium chloride. So how much cadmium chloride did I add here? So I started off with a concentration of 5 times 10 to minus 4 molar. I added 5 mils, and therefore concentration times volume gives me the amount of moles that I actually added of that cadmium chloride. Taking the molecular weight of the cadmium, it tells, which is, they give you that 112.4, tells me that the amount of grams of cadmium in that 30 mils is 2.81 times 10 to the minus 4. So that tells me then that I have, in adding that 5 mils to the 25 mils originally, I've actually added in an activity of 50.83. So these two, 50.83 and this 2.81, are kind of related to one another. I've turned 2.81 back into grams per mil because I just divided it basically by 30. So I've got 9.37 times 10 to the minus 6 grams per mil of cadmium gives me 50.83 current. Now what I've then done is actually taken this 50.83, divide it by the 9.37, and I'm saying that I get 5.43 times 10 to the minus 6 of current per gram per milliliter of cadmium. So that's my kind of that's my activity, that a gram per mil of cadmium gives me this much current. So I got, so what I then do then is actually look at the original current. So originally I had 32 current in that original 25 mils. I had 32 of current. If I take that 32 of current, divide it by the 5.43 times 10 to the 6, I end up with 5.9 times 10 to the minus 6. So what I'm saying here is that I've in fact got, in order to have that 32, I must have in that sample a concentration of cadmium of 5.9 times 10 to the minus 6. I must have this concentration per grams or grams per mil of cadmium. And therefore, the original metal concentration in total was 0.004. But in fact, that's a mixture of zinc and cadmium. But in order to get that 32, I must have this much concentration of cadmium, 5.9 times 10 to minus 6. You take 5.9 times 10 to minus 6 divided by 0.004 and turn it to percentage, you get 0.15% of cadmium in the original zinc metal. So the answer to your question is, I believe it's 0.15% by mass of cadmium in the original zinc, and yeah, that's at least for me, that's the answer that I calculated last night. That all said, the reason I did that was just really for a sort of bit of fun myself, and also to kind of open up the mind to thinking about other applications of our our heavy metal sensors as well. I will, whoops-a-daisy, I will turn that back on now so you can see me and go forward with the rest of the webinar. So I was asked about alternatives to screen printed carbon electrodes. I would suggest a 501, but you will need a decent connector, so I do have to emphasize that. You need to look at your potentiostat and look what kind of cables you have coming from your potentiostat. What the connector you need from us is a 7mm SPE connector, but you have to look at your potentiostat and say, has it got 2mm banana plugs? Does it have 3mm banana plugs? When I say millimeter, I mean the diameter of those banana plugs, or is it 4mm? I suspect you're either 2mm or 4mm. If you've got a Metron potentiostat or an Autolab potentiostat, I suspect it's 4mm. If you have a ZP or a PalmSense potentiostat, then I suspect it's 2mm. But you do have to get the connectors. Number 3 is really about calcium, potassium, and sodium for the skin. It's probably just worth saying that ZP has a lot of experience in making measurements on or through the skin. We do a lot of transdermal work. This is kind of serious work that we have to do. Not have to do, we do it as part of paid programs. This is akin to the kind of things like the Abbott Freestyle Libre 3, which is a CGM sensor. We do a lot of microneedles. We do have 50 patents around microneedles at ZP. We do sweat analysis. I'll do a case study on sweat analysis in a bit. And we also do an implanted device as well. This is really going quite well, but the questioner today is not doing implantation. And implantation is a serious endeavor and really has to be funded properly to really get involved in doing implanted sensors. Obviously, we do have all these biosensors, and we're really good through our Sense It All platform, actually putting them onto the skin, driving them through the app, getting the raw data up to the app, and then also sort of correlating with sensors that may be already on the market, and that can really help us with algorithm development as well. All that said, I'll put a little link there as well, which is cool. We do also have these wire sensors. This is something that I don't have videos on it today, but these wire sensors are actually this one ends up getting embedded into fish, and obviously the fish survive. And we're measuring biomarkers in fish. We do a lot of work on microneedles. Microneedles are just a way of doing, I would call, sort of minimally invasive continuous monitoring. And we do sweat analysis as well, where we put the kind of sensors into these kind of sweat patches. The sweat patches sit on the skin, and we can measure in the sweat. This is a case study of doing some sweat analysis where we took one of our lactate sensors, we put it in a sweat patch, and then we drove it with our electronics. I will touch upon the electronics in a minute, and we made Bluetooth connection to it. We got the guy to essentially work out, and we were able to gather data in real time. And the data was really surprising for us because actually it worked, really well. And I think it's more of a kind of a tribute to the fact that lactate actually is at quite high concentrations in the body, especially when you undergo anaerobic respiration. And it was quite nice because we were able to sort of look at literature results as well and see actually that we were actually correlating quite strongly with what was happening in academia as well. Now, this particular person is particularly interested in the potassium sensor, so we do have the potassium sensor. I think outside of a significant project with us, I think most of the things we can talk about really are on the website. So I'll put a link here. This is the potassium sensor. Potassium sensor is actually one of the most mature sensors we have, and you're welcome to buy it and try it. But in terms of longevity and etc., it's the data on the website that you can use. If you engage us in a proper program, we can have a deeper conversation about it. The calcium sensor, a quick comment is it's not as matured as the potassium sensor, and I would also say the sodium sensor is actually quite a matured sensor. So I would say one thing: don't do more. Start off with one or two of these. Don't necessarily just jump in to all three of them. The sodium and potassium is what I'm recommending at the moment, particularly the potassium, because I think that's the most matured sensor we have. But the data I'm able to give you is that's on the website, unless there's a program with a budget and then the ZP team can sort of swing in and support you a bit more. It's probably worth saying that because we have the Sense It All platform, we also have the electronics available that drive all this platform as well. So there is a kit out there. I should have put a link to it, called the single purpose biosensor circuit. This is the kit that we would help support. That support would be limited because there'll be a point where actually the support you require is not really electronics. The support you require is actually application, and that we would only be able to do as part of a program. So that said, my recommendation is go for the potassium and the sodium sensor, in particular the potassium sensor. I suspect you're quite a strong engineer, so the only other part that I would suggest then is the single purpose biosensor circuit. Otherwise, if you engage us in a program, then we can help you a lot more. Question number 4 is how to get a senior role in electrochemistry. So if you're only interested in the technical, you can stop now, but I will answer this question as well. I'll just do a quick walkthrough. I mean, there's no blueprint to how to get a senior role in electrochemistry, but maybe if I can give you a quick walkthrough. I mean, this is my own career. I was fortunate enough as an undergraduate to do a year out in industry. So I was lucky enough to go to GSK, worked as a medicinal chemist. That gave me some experience, and also gave me an experience of big corporations. And also gave me a really good final year in university because I was so well trained up by GSK. So, that was a good, start to things. I say here that I went to Abbott, but between GSK, I went back to university, completed my degree, then did a PhD. Now, this is where this particular questioner is at then, is, they're sort of finishing their PhD. Now, my first job, I know I really got no help at all from the university in those days. I think universities really weren't set up the way they are necessarily now. There was no, I think it's easier maybe for undergraduates that actually there are employability, professionals now at universities, let's say, to try and help you on this path. It's probably less so for PhDs and postdocs. So I can understand, it's a bit daunting. I mean, but with the Abbott position, let's say, I must have applied, just so many jobs. I might have applied for 50 jobs, to be honest with you. I mean, they were all, quite scientific, but it was very hard to actually match what I thought my skill set was and actually what these jobs were actually asking for. But in the end, the reason I probably got the role with Abbott was they were looking for an electrochemist. So I did have an electrochemistry background, but they were that, but I wasn't, and I'll say it openly, I wasn't necessarily their first choice. They'd already had offered the position to other people who had more of a sort of, I would describe as a kind of bio-electroanalytical background, whereas mine was more sort of synthetic background. But I did a lot of applications and eventually got called for interview and went to Abbott. At which point then you're kind of hired as a senior electrochemist, but I'm not sure really how senior that really was. It was maybe just in title. But I stayed there for 2 years. But what I realized was that being a scientist in a large corporation, you can sometimes be quite far from actually being able to generate that corporation value today. As a scientist, you're possibly generating value in the future, but you're not necessarily adding value to the company today. So I sort of realized that, being a scientist, and I've been one at GSK now, and now I was one at Abbott. So I'd sort of seen the pattern that, being a scientist and sort of thinking that will help you progress, up the business is, it's not necessarily work like that. What I did notice was that what was respected at Abbott were people who were actually interested in quality assurance, regulatory assurance. So this is not something that I'd ever sort of even thought about at university. But there's a lot of regulation in the med tech industry. There's a lot of regulation in a lot of industries, including batteries, etc. There's all sorts of ISO standards or EU regulations. So I realized that was actually held in higher esteem, let's say, being what's called a regulatory assurance or quality assurance manager than necessarily being a good scientist. And I also realized that project management was a skill set that Abbott really respected, maybe, even more so than some scientific skills. So that made me realize, okay, I need to I need to think beyond just science here. So that Abbott was actually undergoing some redundancies at the time. So I actually applied for a company called HEL, Hazard Evaluation Laboratories, as a project management position. Now this was quite a so these were two big companies, GSK and Abbott, and then by then going to a small company, smaller companies will always give you a much more rounded experience, because in a small company you end up wearing a lot of hats. So I went into this small company as a kind of project manager, but I soon found myself essentially it wasn't just managing the project, it was essentially doing the project, putting together equipment, testing equipment, installing equipment, driving around doing installations, going to Austria doing installations, really getting a kind of mix between technical and customer facing. And near the end at HEL, I actually went into more of a sales position, and I did that for a couple of months. Now HEL was also having some problems at the time, so this is a common thing. Or I'd also say in industries as well that companies. Then there's no such, I don't want to state the obvious. There's no such thing as job for life, let's say. So HEL had some troubles. I went to a company called Cirrus. Now Cirrus was doing microfluidics. They were doing organic synthesis in microfluidics. I took a role there. I was starting to work on what they call batch reactors. I had a background in chemistry, so that was kind of useful. So I suppose at this point now, I'd kind of been a synthetic chemist at GSK, and at this point now I'm at Cirrus doing chemical reactors. So I was able to sort of understand, let's say, the end user's experience, which is probably something that when you're trying to add value or do product development, understanding what the end user wants is probably more often what happens is people have technology and they try to apply the technology into a problem, whereas sometimes you can actually understand what the problem is and then look for the technology solution. But Cirrus I was really working then in more of a sort of marketing role. But Cirrus then actually needed to increase sales. And there was an opportunity came up just to say, well, look, Martin, will you go to California and literally just set up an office for essentially sales for us in California? Now, there's nothing in the first three things that would suggest to you that actually I could go to California and set up an office. But taking an opportunity or taking a challenge, is naturally in my mindset. So I ended up taking the challenge, going to California. Literally had nowhere to, it's fine, had nowhere to stay. Just traveling around, doing conferences, doing meetings, and I got fortunate, and it sort of really took off. Now, one of my customers picked me up then. They were called, I hardly remember the name now, but it was called AIC, Applied Intellectual Capital. So they were impressed with the way I sort of spoke, the way I kind of understood science. And AIC was fortunately actually very strong in electrochemistry. So there I am with an electrochemistry background. I suppose I didn't mention my PhD from Southampton too much, but they knew Southampton. They held it in quite high respect. So AIC hired me. That was... But then I found that the AIC is actually in trouble as well. So at which point then somebody at AIC said to me, you should set up a company, because AIC was was having trouble. So I set up a company, in fact. I mean, that was just that kind of California thing that logically, if the job you're in is going to disappear, what should you do? Well, you should set up a company and work for yourself. I had no background in setting up a company. I'd never worked for myself, but I just went ahead and sort of did it, if I can put it that way. So I set that up, and then I ended up hiring a building, consulting for a while, taking the revenues from consulting and basically building up a lab and hiring people. And that went well for a couple of years. From there, I did a very similar thing. I did Best Bio. That didn't last 18 months. But I suppose what I'm saying here is I did have a couple of trips on the way. When I say trips, I slightly fell. ZTS and Best Bio were kind of my first ventures of doing my own thing, let's say. But it did, what did it teach me? It taught me I don't say every aspect of business, but it did teach me, how to sell, how to market, how to run accounts, and how to essentially set up labs, etc. And then I met my business partner, and we set up Zimmer and Peacock. Now this was 9 years ago, and and this is where we are today. This is what we're talking about today. Just a quick comment from ZP that when you have been around a while and you have learned a lot of science, you're not actually excluded from academia. I mean, I do own this. I do have this senior lecturer position also at Swansea University as well. So you're not excluded, but the academic bit only really popped up at nearer the end of this talk because so I focus mostly on industry. Now, the real question to get back to your real question, which is how do you get a senior position in electrochemistry, let's say, the really senior positions I have are today. And I think the quick answer is I promoted myself into those positions because I set up my own company. My first senior position was actually at Abbott. In order to get it, I made something like 50 applications. But there, as a senior scientist, I realized actually I need to become more rounded in terms of, first of all, project management, sales, marketing, and then having done that, actually done marketing, sales, project management, then I was actually pretty good for actually starting up a business, which is where I'm at today. So the quick answer to the question is, in the first instance, to get your foot in the door, it actually just requires a lot of persistence. And that's why I was kind of talking about networking earlier on, that going to conferences sometimes where actually the industry are at, and not necessarily going to conferences where academia is at, because academia will only hire you into postdocs. And if that's the path for you, great. But if you wanted to get into industry, you have to go to conferences or expos, especially if you're in the Coventry area. You've got the NEC, the National Exhibition Centre. They have massive engineering focused conferences at that. You literally walk around trying to talk to all the companies, introducing yourself and finding out if you can find a role. You'd be surprised if you walk around a conference for a day, especially an industry conference. I'm thinking about some of the engineering conferences. You'll meet 100 engineering companies. You possibly will actually find a role that way. It's not something that everyone does, but if you're not bold, then you won't get, unfortunately. So I suppose one of the things I've noticed then when I think about this is, to get a senior position, I've always been willing to work. I've always taken the opportunities, and I'm always constantly learning. Even these webinars are part of that kind of constantly learning challenge. Question number 1 today was about the cadmium zinc, and that's something I should be able to do. But of course, keeping myself constantly challenged and keeping myself fresh. So I'm always constantly kind of learning. This is not a book I've read, but there is a book out there called The 7 Habits of Successful People. I'm not suggesting successful people, I would say, were Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. So I'm not trying to suggest that. But when I look at this habits of 7 people, being proactive, I'm definitely a proactive person. I just suggested just now, if you're looking for your first role in industry, going to the NEC where they have engineering expos where companies turn up and they're in the engineering and science space and they're presenting their products, and you talk to the sales guys and you find out if there's any things going on. That's being proactive. When it says here, begin with the end in mind, this habits of successful people is kind of more generic than just finding your first job. But if I was to look at ZP, I always had the end in mind with ZP, that I really wanted to solve real world problems. And I knew that at the time, Internet of Things was the next movement. So when you look at ZP, you could actually say that we're actually an Internet of Things company with sensors at the heart of it. And I've always had that in mind. And at this point, we definitely are that company. So I've always had that, you have a destination, and then it's a journey on that way there. So you don't sort of veer off in all sorts of strange directions. Even though the path is not straight, the path can wind a bit. But as long as you have the goal in mind at the sort of beginning of it, I think put first things first is kind of an interesting comment. I definitely do this. You will have a list of things that are important and urgent. So I always I always kind of have a to-do list, but I go through it and say, is this really, do I really need to do this, or actually just keep it on the list, and when I've got some spare moments, I'll do it. So So for, if I could sort of list that, you've got two things you're going to do. Are you going to do that resume and send that and do that job application, or are you going to do essentially something else? And I would say, first things first, do the things that are important, get your foot in the door. So for example, I consume very little. I very rarely, well, I never play computer games. I never watch, TV or any kind of live streaming stuff. I'm sort of very focused. So in order to get things done, you sometimes have to free up time. So sort of cut away all the things that are otherwise distracting you. Win-win is a generic kind of thing, which is, I do have this in mind, that if you can help people and you both do well out of it, that's much more long-term. That's definitely a long-term strategy. There are some people who actually will essentially take, they'll have a short-term strategy, which is, in the short, what I mean by that is that they win, you lose, but that doesn't really last in the long run. It's not a good long-term strategy. This is a fair comment. First, understand to be understood. Let's say I was making that comment earlier on about actually to find your first job, you might actually have to be proactive about it. And when you go into those situations, rather than talking about yourself, you might actually ask them questions about what the company does. What do they struggle with? You can listen, and then you can actually match up things that or things that you can do to actually solve some of those problems. So I think it's always good to listen and then maybe speak. Synergize. I mean, synergy is really about. So, for example, if you've got a PhD, then you have a synergy between potentially as a potential employer, and you're the part of the potential solution. But also your academic network is also part of the solution that you can bring to that employer, that potential employer. So, that would be an example of, your value is more than just yourself and the particular skills that you have. It may be your network as well. When they say sharpen the sword here, they say sort of take time to sort of rest and reflect. I think, yes, I mean, reflecting is something I do. I'm not sure I do resting quite so well. But in order to kind of, reflect, actually, I do, again, cut out of my life things that are otherwise distracting. So you will, and I know this particular questioner knows that, I am on LinkedIn, but it's the only social media I really use because it's business orientated and it's something businesses I'm super interested in, but I'm never on Twitter, I'm never on Facebook, etc. because these kind of things they're not moving necessarily the business or my career forward. So it is good to reflect. In order to have time to reflect, you might have to cut away some, because I have to work hard and I need to reflect. So there's something has to give, and it might be some of the distractions have to give. So let me just do a quick summary of the questions this week. I hope I did the calculation on cadmium in zinc. It looked to be 0.15%. I did do the recommendation for the SPE, the screen printed carbon electrodes, rather than SPCE, and it was the 501. But also get some connectors. I suspect that you'll need a 7mm connector for probably a 2mm or 4mm diameter banana plug. Question number 3, we do have that potassium, sodium and calcium sensor. My recommendation is you're probably best off starting with the potassium and sodium sensor. And there is also the single purpose biosensor circuit, because I think you're actually quite a strong engineer and you like to do things for yourself. I don't think you're going to necessarily engage ZP on that project, but if you did, we'd be really good at it. And if you're looking for a senior position in electrochemistry, like I say, to get my foot in the door with that first business, it was easily 50 applications. And because of your geographical location, I said, do the 50 applications and look for what conferences or what expos are appearing at, for example, the NEC, and actually just walk them and be proactive, which is one of the habits of being a successful person. So with that, I want to say thank you very much. If you've got any questions of ZP, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Okay, thanks very much.